Coming up, later in this video I interview Alex Kerr about his eye-opening book Manufactured Fear and how it explains the success of Nigel Farage's latest political vehicle, Reform 2025 Limited, a fear-mongering machine built on blame culture which targets migrants, crime, big government and restrictions on hate speech. But first, I'll take a look at this week's policy relaunch from Reform and in particular their new slogan, Britain is lawless. Stay tuned. Even those on the opposite side of the political spectrum sometimes credit Nigel Farage as a man with his finger on the pulse of the great unwashed British electorate. But he's not. Far from it. This privately educated ex-commodities trader has merely understood the tactic of using fear as a means of political control. The fear manufactured by Farage, Reform 2025 Limited and their copycats in Kemi Badenoch's Tory party function by amplifying anxiety about crime, immigration, state surveillance, while offering simplistic strongman solutions that crumble the moment they meet the real world, as Donald Trump is discovering in America. But before we get into what that means for British politics, could I just remind you to check that you're subscribed to the channel, give this video a like and hit that notifications bell. Access to my videos will always remain free, but if you'd like to help support the channel, memberships are now available, attracting a number of perks. Full details on the links below. So, I mentioned that Farage's go-to tactic is merely to amplify fear and then offer simplistic, unrealistic solutions to exaggerated problems. Some examples of this are Farage last month unveiling a £17 billion campaign promising to halve crime in 5 years, to recruit 30,000 extra police officers, to build 5 so-called Nightingale prisons, to deport over 10,000 foreign criminals and to rent prison space abroad. Wow, sounds tough, right? Sounds impressive, perhaps. But analysts from respected journal The Economist point out that there's no costed financial model, no real evidence, no policy backbone, just a simple soundbite. The rhetoric of Britain is lawless. But practicalities don't matter to Farage. The point is, according to Rachel Wolf, that on crime and culture, Reform are sending the message, we are really serious about this and we might just be mad enough to do it. But as The Economist points out, these policies add yet more dubious numbers to tax and spending plans that already look primed to cause a Liz Truss-style panic in the markets. The slogan, Britain is lawless, is central to Farage's fear strategy. But this is just a conceit with no basis in fact. It's only in Farage's wet dreams that Britain actually is lawless. The statistics tell us very clearly that the Britain of the mid-1990s was a vastly more dangerous place than the one we live in today. In 2025, you're far less likely to be mugged, far less likely to be burgled, and far less likely to be assaulted. And we all know this on some level. But Farage somehow succeeds in ramping up the irrational fear so that that knowledge gets pushed out from our brains. That's the playbook that my guest this week, Alex Kerr, writes about in his book Manufactured Fear. Speak about existing anxieties, reinforce and amplify them to destroy rationality, then pose yourself as the solution. Cue Alex. Hi Alex, thank you so much for joining me again. It's a real pleasure to have you on. Would you like to just introduce yourself?
Political historian currently. Got a degree in history, worked in various jobs, and then came back into history and politics onto YouTube. That sort of ended up with me doing this.
Why does that book look familiar, Alex? Oh, that'll be because I've been reading it, which is why I asked you to come on the channel as a guest this week, because I found this absolutely fascinating. Manufactured Fear, the Power of Division. You're looking at how politicians through the ages, if you like, and not just politicians, but people in power have been using fear as an incredible weapon to get control over people.
I feel that fear is somewhat embedded in the human population. And for natural reasons. We weren't apex predators. We had a fear instinct that helped us survive. And it's still there and it's easily triggered. The idea of fight and flight as a survival mechanism, it's still embedded in us. And from the historical readings, it's still there. You know, people come up with insane conclusions as to why they've got problems, such as the Salem witch trials or Nigel Farage and migration. There's a blame culture. It's not a solution culture. We were talking off air about Nigel Farage and his speech But some of the policies that they were asking him about, he didn't have answers to either. And it's that's where it ties into manufactured fear. It's all about just scaring you into voting it in, but there's actually no substance to solve the problem. It's about blame and fear as opposed to really fixing what the issues are. And it's no different with the migrant crisis. There's that embedded fear which kept us alive, and then we haven't really developed mechanisms around that. Even though there is a section at the end of the book with a load of suggestions as to how we can try and get people to overcome that.
What one thing made you think, got to write a book about this?
It's based partly on my enthusiasm for Noam Chomsky. He did a book called Manufactured Consent, which is the idea of convincing people to go in a certain direction that I think you and I would be aware of, like the Iraq War. All the papers just lined it up and said, we're 45 minutes from doom. We better go and take that guy out right now. So it's this idea of manufacturing a consensus to get the public to go in a certain direction. And you could look at that with all the examples I've given. It's all manufactured.
Can we include Brexit in that?
Oh, 100%.
The famous poster with Nigel Farage warning about all these brown people coming in, for example.
You just see this reoccurring pattern. Of course, I've worked on the rise of Mussolini and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And you just started to go, oh, I can see similar rhetoric coming out. And it's always that sort of slippery slope. And we're on it at the moment. I mean, the rise of Farage, although ironically, and throughout history, you see this, it's only about 30%, isn't it?
Yeah, high 20s, isn't it?
What I will say, though, is Mussolini and Hitler, they only ever got 33% of the vote. How is it that they're blaming arguably the weakest, less politically able as the cause of the problems, and not the people in charge?
And their interest is to distract attention from the growing disparity of wealth in this country, and instead focus on, as you say, the most vulnerable, the poorest.
We are living in wild times. And going back to the original question, that's why I wrote this, because I just see the patterns re-emerging.
Just to finish off, going back to your book, Manufactured Fear, The Power of Division, Alex Kerr. Where can people get hold of this, Alex?
Amazon, and about to release a Kindle edition as well.
Thank you so much for coming on, Alex. Good to see you. We'll catch up in person soon, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Rob.
Looking through the lens of Alex's book, Reform UK's summer policy push is completely transparent with its focus on crime, immigration and fear. On immigration, Farage has been relentless. As protests over asylum seekers in hotels swept across England last month, he demanded the police release the ethnicity of suspects, claiming a cover-up by authorities. His rhetoric conflates asylum seekers and sexual violence with absolutely no statistical backing or evidence. Classic manufactured fear. That protest wave, starting on 13th of July and spreading to over a dozen towns in England, was used by Farage as ammunition. He described them as evidence of systemic asylum failure, reinforcing his wet dream narrative of public disorder fueled by uncontrolled immigration. Again, with no evidence or statistics whatsoever. Meanwhile, Farage's newly appointed justice advisor, former prison governor Vanessa Frake, has slammed the prison system as a warehouse producing better criminals. Again, it sounds like the typical reform tactic of manufacturing fear to create division. And she is also calling for tougher regimes, but also substance abuse services in prison. But okay, so far so Farage. But she also stirred controversy by opposing categorical bans on trans women in female prisons, preferring individual risk assessments. So there's a bit of nuance there in her view. And nuance goes down with Reform 2025 Limited like a bucket of cold sick. The party quickly distanced itself from Frake's well thought out position, so at odds with the party's hardline, black and white simplistic approach to its policies. On a different note, City AM polling in early August suggests that voters now see Reform UK as the most pro-business party at Westminster, largely driven by its promises of corporate tax cuts and deregulation. But look closer. The low-tax manifesto pledges require massive public spending cuts, with no fleshed-out detail of where those cuts will be made. You can be sure Farage's billionaire backers and chums won't be affected, as these cuts will be targeted at the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. Voters are being sold the fantasy of prosperity after cutting public services, as if austerity hasn't already dragged this country down over the last 15 years. So, for Farage, Reform 2025 Limited is just a rehash of his usual modus operandi, to manufacture fear and then offer simplistic, uncosted solutions. And Farage always offers the same bundle of fear. Fear of crime, fear of migrants, fear of big government censorship, fear of social change, and fear of minorities. He offers British values, whatever they might be, wrapped up in a strongman common sense narrative while deflecting scrutiny of policy coherence and dodging real world facts. In short, here's the pattern with acknowledgements to Alex Kerr. 1. Generate or amplify fear. 2. Frame yourself as the only tough fix. 3. Resist scrutiny and detail. 4. Rebrand progressive ideas as existential threats to British identity. But unlike genuine law and order reformers, Farage's verbiage offers short-term slogans while offering no long-term solutions. So I agree with Alex Kerr when he writes about fear being a manufactured commodity, sold to you, profited from, repeated. This is the strategy that Nigel Farage's Reform 2025 Limited is following. Neil Basu, a former assistant commissioner with the Metropolitan Police, said of Reform's "Britain is lawless" slogan that it's appealing to the worst kind of populist sentiment. Asked if such rhetoric could contribute to a risk of violence, Basu said, "Yes. They should be very careful about the language they use. It is capable, demonstrably, of causing violence." The former Labour Justice Secretary, Charlie Falconer, said, "The language is much, much worse than it ever was 5 years ago. There's a more angry electorate, and there's too many politicians willing to use lurid language." That's what brought about Farage's Brexit, and he hopes that this manufactured fear will also be what brings about his election as Britain's next Prime Minister.